I have a request. Even if it's for just 20 minutes, if you could suspend your notion of what a master plan is. You know, for most of us, a master plan is a pretty drawing with a lot of unusual colors, road patterns, that sort of thing. And for the 20-minute segment here, I want you to just suspend that and think of it in a different way, because what we really have here is a way of thinking more than a land plan or a drawing. So, I need to, oh my, okay. Well, I do want to open up with an aspect of this that John mentioned, which is, do you have your copy of Design with Nature?
Yes.
Yeah, right here it is.
Right there.
This little tiny book, in 1970, when I was still in school, Ian McCard was a juror. He was one of three members of a jury, and the other two were extremely well-known architects who I've since forgotten their names. But Ian McCard, who I'd never heard of, and was all of his architects were offended that a landscape architect would be on a jury, asked the most interesting questions of all the students there. He didn't ask, why did you design it this way? He said, tell me about the site. And then someone would be shocked, what site? I'm doing a building, right? And then he'd say, well, tell me what the site was like 20 years ago. And what he was trying to do was school us into the whole sense of context, that you're part of a bigger picture. So this quote of John Muir is very timely as it relates to Ian McCard. So fast forward to 74, when my wife, who's at the back of the room, who's the real Permar here at Kiawah, was hired by one of the earliest hires for the new entity of the, I think it was called Kiawah Beach Company, right? And we were living in Savannah at the time, and she came home and she said, you will not believe this place called Kiawah. And in our business, it's not unusual for us to hear from people, you've got to come and see this site, this most beautiful site in the world. And you go, and it's okay. But it was rare for Diana to do this. So after a while, I finally joined her on a trip when she had a work session with Frank and his team. And two things, damned if she wasn't right. You know, it was just hard. And it was a moment where I wanted to be part of it. I'm going to get emotional here. So I'm going to mix it up. I'm going to get out of the emotion stage. So before we get into the planning part, let me share with you a couple of nuggets of things that happen in the development process that challenge a vision. This drawing, let's see. This drawing that's East Beach Conference Center right there. That's Town Center. That's the Sanctuary Hotel. Before all of this happened, this was a 1,000-room hotel in two pieces, proposed by then Landmark Land, who was the first entity that came in, if you remember, on a new strategy, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And as I remember Frank walking into the room, and as is always Frank's way of doing things, is, he was like, I'm not certain you understand the site here. The next version is a little hard to see here, but for those of you that live in Turtle Point Villas, this is the 18th fairway, right here. This is where the clubhouse location is. And all along this fairway on this side was an idea that the Sea Pines group had in the best of their thought process in different locations of the sports garden or sports manor, right, Frank? It's actually a pretty cool idea, where well in advance of the whole wellness, the exercise world that we live in today, it was this collision of all of these sporting, wellness, health-related events all in one location, sort of like an ESPN zone on steroids, sort of thing. And the next one is, this is Rhett's Bluff, right here. This is the causeway. You come across the causeway, Bass Pond over here. At one time, this was going to be the third significant resort village. It was going to be a marina. It was called Quayside. It was going to be a significant resort village with a broad range of residential types. Probably, I think the different models were 400 to 600 units up there, a lot of commercial, obviously the classic lighthouse and so forth. And the reason I want to share those with you is, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right, I'm not clicking, right? Is why didn't those happen? Why didn't those things happen the way they did? Well, I'd like to think that it was largely a part of what your values are. The best way, some of you have heard me say this, we all woke up this morning and started a whole series of personal decisions that either reinforce our values or diminish them. They're little tiny things. And they have odd ways of showing up. For me, it's, I can't leave a hotel room without making the bed. Sorry. I don't really make the bed, but I feel it, right? Well, whenever I'll speak for myself, whenever I've gotten into a bad place and turn around, how did I get here? It was usually tiny little decisions that tested my value system. Well, communities are like that. Companies are like that. And the values that are largely attributed to the different decades of ownership and stewardship by the management teams here generally revolved around those particular values on top and a way of doing business below. And I want to lead with the second point on top, respect for the environment, and on the way of doing business, two things: comprehensive planning, which John mentioned in terms of a broad base of planning expertise, and leadership by example. That is, you just don't tell people what to do, you actually do it yourself. So we go on to the others. I think I've always wanted this opportunity to publicly say to Frank that his team that he constructed, mobilized, and led to the entitlements in 1975 after the 74 assessment and a lot of planning work by others. I think the approvals were in 75, if I'm not mistaken, Frank, was a remarkable period. And there'll be a slide here that pretty much shows you the context, not unlike what John was saying. It was unusual to do what they did. Even with the best thoughts and the best experiences of the Sea Pines management team, the challenges here were much greater. So if we go on. But let me just step back, and I think most of you know this, but let me give you a sense of scale and dimension about Kiawah. If you went down to the very tip of the peninsula in Charleston and looked out toward Fort Sumter and then decided I'm going to walk the spine right up I-26 as far as if I went from the end of Kiawah on the east end to Captain Sam's at the other tip. The next slide will show you how far that is. It's out beyond the airport. Kiawah's big. And we all know that. We walk out to the beach, you look at the ends and so forth. But Kiawah is a big American landscape. The next slide gives you a sort of statistical dimension, sort of where we're at right now. The reference to 5,400 or so maximum dwelling units, and that's an estimate based upon remaining areas to be developed. So far, properties that are sold to date are just slightly under 4,300. The sense here is we are a mature community. We have a different context for the responsibilities going forward than necessarily the earlier group did in 74, 75. The challenges are similar but different because of this maturity. Instead of a handful of people around a table making decisions, it's us. It's all of us. It's 4,300 plus other vested parties. This is an estimate in terms of peak population, but it's well above it's above 10,000 at peak times. And we don't need to know that, right, in terms of what the nature of peaks are. And the seasonality shift to the off-season is pretty dramatic. If we could go to the next slide. Every era thinks they have hard times to start a project. Frank, I don't even know what to say, right? I mean, let's go down the topics here. Global recession, energy crisis. You're going to see this is a familiar reference. That second one, unemployment rate, so forth. But look at the inflation number. Remember when that was such a hot topic, and the importance of availability of money in terms of discount rates and prime rates. But on the right side there, You know, we think Washington's odd, sort of an odd mess right now. These were unusual times in America. Hopefully we never have to go through one of these again. And Charleston MSA, the three-county area, was a modest 378,000. And right now, just to give you a reference, it's estimated over 700,000. We could go to the next one. Now, the next two slides are important in terms of conveying to you the translation of what John was talking about, as well as other disciplines, when you start to meld a business plan and develop a team and a common vision. So I point out during this period, the Kuwaiti period, to establish a balanced use of land from both nature's and man's perspective. Balance, designing with nature, design with nature. It's a cooperative process, it's a collaborative process. Balancing between the natural environment and community, commitment to comprehend. You can see the key points here. This is stated, Frank stated these before Charleston County Council at that time, of saying this is who we are. This is who we are going to be in the future, and the values attributed to how we conduct business. We go to the next one. And now these are about the structuring elements. This is beginning to establish the sense of vision. The first one is very important because it's slightly different now. It was a very calculated reference, seaside resort community. In fact, if you remember the old monument sign out front, was the Kiawah logo, a seaside resort community. It was very progressive and aggressive as the role of the resort at that time. That was the lead story. We were a community, our community, but resort was a much more significant part of it. You'll see later on the idea of these resort villages. There were three significant resort villages: West Beach, East Beach, the River Village, and then there were subsets to it. Largely as a result of the recommendations of the environmental assessment, which pulled the natural systems apart, evaluated those, and reconstructed those in terms of levels of sensitivity to development. It began to suggest where intense development by Kiawah standards could occur in these villages. The open space system. The open space system here is not a residual. It is the framework in which development takes place. Most of the rest of the world, the open space, green space system is leftover land, residual, set aside. No, this is part of the fabric here. And unilateral development. This is a key business point in terms of the company did everything. It planned, designed, developed, operated everything. It owned all of the major facilities, singular entity. Going forward, if we can go to the next. All right, now this next series of slides, here I'll just go ahead and do it. This starts to show the general context. This image was, I believe, taken in probably about 1975 or so, before any significant landslide. Is probably about 75, where you can see work going on in Causeway. And there were certain bridge improvements because, if I'm not mistaken, Frank, the old bridge at the beginning couldn't sustain any of the significant traffic. So it was starting to alter itself at that point. Yeah, in terms of activity. But as John pointed out, and you read the environmental assessment and bond it with design with nature by Ian McCard, it is a classic barrier island of this part of the world, right? The surrounding marshland and river, the creeks that sort of interface with it, and interface with the maritime forest. There were large impoundments. Still, you see that this is the preserve, the Blue Heron Pond and the preserve. These earlier shots were before Hugo, so our dense maritime forest was a little bit more dense then, but it's healed itself pretty well. And then a dramatic dune field and beach. And this collision of all these physical elements, for you moviegoers, it's like the opening scene in Prince of Tides. And the closing scene in Shakespeare in Love, you know, when Gwyneth Paltrow is walking on the beach after a shipwreck. I'm still looking for Diana. Oh, Diana's already left, I guess. But it was powerful in terms of that. And because of the standards established to date, that power is retained. There was reference to what was in place before any substantial development. On the left were these old logging roads that had great names like 5 Mile Road, 8 Mile Road, right? And a handful of in our historic district along Eugenia in the bottom right there. And if you remember the reference to the horses that weren't wild horses, but were on their own at the east end. In fact, the early years, when you go down there, you'd take apples, right? And the horses would come up to the jeeps and so forth. But it was compelling. It was a compelling environment. All right, this strange sketch, which is about that big, was done by Jim Mosley, one of the lead planners at the time. And it's the acronym is CRDU, Critical Resort Development Unit, I believe. And it was pulling from the best experiences and minds of the Sea Pines Management Group in terms of all their experiences all over the place. And the idea was within a 5-minute walking distance of that circumference. The center of that was the 150-room inn, and then all of the conveniences, all of the significant residential types, villas, cottages, and so forth, were all within that 5-minute walking distance. Because, quite frankly, in America, that's as far as Americans will walk before they have to be in a car, right? So, but everything, tennis, golf, beach, pool, everything was within that walking distance. And this shot on the left is now different now because the 150-room inn is now void. And Mr. Goodwin is reconsidering what to do in there. But the two villages really were addressing that sort of walking distance relationship. They mirrored with the environmental assessment in terms of where that sort of intense development would take place, and responded to market conditions that were clear and pertinent at that time. Now this shot of the Osprey Beach area, which is, I took this probably about 10 years ago, so the dune field has propagated quite a ways. Is our first example of solving multiple problems with a singular solution. The environmental assessment suggested where a self-imposed setback should be on the beach, not where the state suggests, or anyone else. The state actually, I keep forgetting here, can't multitask. At the time this shot was taken, the state said you could build all the way up to that line right there, based upon their information. But early on, and this was not an easy decision, one of the questions I would like to ask Frank is, the environmental assessment suggested one thing. I'm sure the financial group internally said, I don't know. I mean, this is like a whole, but here's the idea is, you wouldn't necessarily, in terms of politics, you wouldn't necessarily lead with, this is the right thing to do, this is the environmentally responsible thing to do. The business point on this is that you transfer the value of the beach and the dune field to the vast majority of land that's in the financial model. The vast majority of the land yet to be sold is interior land. That's where the real mission is on a business plan like this. That's where the pressure point is. So the theory was to establish a line that was appropriate from an environmental standpoint, but when you do it that way, when I'm walking from my house on the marsh side to the beach, I don't feel like I'm in someone's backyard. So it worked. The model worked. I'm sure there was a lot of breath holding on that, but the model worked. And so, but an amazing thing happened, which is not only did non-oceanfront property increase in value, oceanfront property increased in value. People got it. They discovered they have the ocean, they have a foreground view. They don't feel like someone's in their backyard. So that was a positive unintended consequence from the financial side. The other thing in these two shots, on the one on the left is Turtle Point. It's an example of, if you want to do an archaeological dig of Kiawah, do the golf courses. Sometime do that. Just look at Cougar Point, Turtle Point, and go on down all the way to the ocean course. You'll see evolution of how to integrate a golf course within the natural environment in terms of the edge conditions. Well, there are 4 things that golf courses do, and it's another example of solving multiple problems with one solution. Sure, it enhances value of property that's along the edge, And generally, it generates positive revenue for the owner-operator of that. But if the truth were really known, the other two is it's part of the master drainage system. All of this is all interconnected. The environmental assessment suggested patterns that then wove with how the golf courses could be. And we have a lagoon system that under the major threat of a storm, we can lower the water elevations into it naturally, not with electric pumps, and absorb a considerable amount of foreground rainfall. We've had to use it. It works. And then the final thing is, on several of the golf courses, it's the final stage of wastewater treatment. So it's four things. One, capital investment. That's head of finance likes these sorts of things. And on the right side, the property owner's beach facility, the sandcastle that we're in right now, is an example too of this sort of oddity condition in which the normal evolution is that someone will come here for a meeting, like it, they like to bring their family back for a vacation, hopefully like it. They evolve in a whole series of steps to eventually doing what many of you have done, which is this is your principal second home or it is your principal home. And this odd thing happens every time you get out of one of those groups and look back, you sort of don't like those people. Now, I'm exaggerating. But the idea of the nature of plans and how they're influenced by conditions is about observation. Again, I exaggerated, please. Now, Becky Dennis would think this is the most favorite picture in the whole slideshow. The utility track. Again, this represented, in terms of Frank's team, long-term thinking, long-term thought process of capital improvements. So the utility track, which was placed between the key resort villages, houses all the things that you're all familiar with in addition to the logical ability to expand it. The thing I would like to point out on this is it's fun. Believe me, it is fun to design and plan beautiful buildings and beautiful settings. And as hard as that is, that's the easy part. This is the hard part, infrastructure and infrastructure systems. And what we have here is a collaborative effort of different entities and different institutions that 24 hours a day, every day of the year, town government, its staff, has certain responsibilities to this community that they fulfill. They're stewards of that. The community association does it. The utility company does it. All of this all these groups that are important in our lives that don't necessarily get the positive glory that the club gets or the resort gets or the real estate sales, which is important. That glory is good too. But if you compare Kiawah to any other comparable community, the real truth is in this collision of these institutions that work very hard together to provide us a great life. And then, again, Diana had to step out, but this is a token here for marketing, which is, no, seriously, the weaving of other disciplines involved in this sort of comprehensive planning approach, this being market research, is you have to learn early on how to grow a market. There are only so many people within a certain drive distance, certain travel distance, that you have to discover ways to weave that. So there were 3 primary market areas, out 200 miles, out 500 miles and beyond, in which there was a very calculated, programmed, integrated marketing and sales effort to increase the chance of success. I'm trying to get through this quickly. Okay, so now we go to a different era. This in the summer of 1988, Frank Brumley 2.0 came in. With his partner Pat McKinney, Charlie Way, the families of Buddy Darby and Leonard Long, did the impossible, which was no one ever thought that the Kuwaitis would sell. And they pulled off a miracle for all of us, quite frankly. But look at the conditions they had within a 2-year period, right? Bank failures, 1,000 plus. Our familiar Middle Eastern crisis thing that we had floored. You'll still see prime rate was pretty expensive. Inflation rate was tame, but the cost of money. But look at what was on the right there. When you develop a business plan, more often than not, you have these key assumptions in there about cost of money market acceptance, and then a bunch of other things. And way down the list is natural disaster. And each time you put a business plan together, each year you keep moving the natural disaster down further and further until all of what we know happened in, what was it, 25 years this year, right? 25 years ago, this past, right? We just passed it, right? September 19th or whatever. Frank Blanche and I were out of the country when that happened, right? But you sort of plan for that, and it's a little bit, I mean, this is awful for a guy to say, but it's a little bit about knowing about pregnancy for your first child. And you know all this stuff about that process until the baby's delivered, and you go, I don't know anything about this. So we knew a whole lot about prepping for hurricanes and getting ready for that. But we had to learn on the fly after the storm. In terms, that picture at the top right, the next time you go down the parkway, that's at the intersection that goes into the Sanctuary Hotel. That was ground zero on Kiawah. Kiawah didn't have the high water that the rest of the county had, fortunately for us. But we had all the same serious winds. It was a tough deal. But the business model held. The financial model held. The business model had. The vision held. And the key structuring elements for this are slightly different in terms of this team. They had a renewed and heightened interest in community, creating a community, expanding the sense of what community is all about. There was a tremendous emphasis on that. The balance of community elements. You'll see residential and resort areas sized located to foster harmony. You'll see an example pretty soon. At the same time, the new town government that had formed early on was wrestling with their own perspective of the role of resort at that time. And there was a calculated decision that you'll see in just a minute about balancing the relationship of resort with residential pattern as opposed to the early years where the resort was slightly more intense. It's not a right-wrong thing, it's a blue-green thing. And then focus expertise, a very calculated element of focus expertise was let's do those things that we know well, and let's someone else that comes in, like the resort side, and they can focus on that. So that was the first split. Instead of unilateral company, it was two companies that shared a common vision. So one of the first decisions was to remove the potential of that river village out of Retz Bluff. And if you remember, the second gate, the Vandross Gate, used to be in a different position. It was relocated to allow for considerable behind-the-gate development at Retz Bluff and the settlement. That was a very, well, this like this now. Instead of a village up there, it's essentially behind the gate. That was a very calculated business decision that helped balance the relationship with the components. The byproduct is this idea of dual focus, that is, the company focusing on residential, private club development, community creation, and another entity, initially Landmark Land, came in. The first benefit of that was the ocean course. Their focus was golf. And we had the benefit of them relocating, or repositioning where the Ryder Cup was. And there's a long story that we can talk about later about Pete Dye being out there right after the hurricane building the course. But that was the first significant event of that change in strategy. And the second one was the Sanctuary Hotel by Virginia Investment Trust. Both of those were done by entities that were very, very focused on resort development as opposed to this sort of shared focus going forward. And I mentioned open space system before, that framework. I mean, it's a hierarchical system that is, and it's a different way of thinking in which instead of having large chunks that are set aside and largely inaccessible, which is not uncommon in certain developments, this is one where we live within the open space system. It's part of who we are. It's the framework in which the development takes place within. So this hierarchical system of preservation areas, conservation areas, recreation areas is a very calculated part of the early vision and accentuated by this second management group that came in. All that white that occurs here is all of us. And we are the final component of that in the sense of every one of our home sites has ground coverage that can't be any greater than about a third of the area. That means we have 2/3 of our home sites available to contribute to the open space system. And I know the Conservancy is very proactive on how that can best be accomplished. As we go down island, it gets higher degree of difficulty. You see these long cheniers, these are old dune fields that begin to separate. It's great from a real estate perspective, but the difficulty of infrastructure placement is really the deft act. And we recalled that whole sense of process that was led by John and his team. That is, we reconnected to it. Remember I mentioned about turning around, losing our values a little bit, how did I get here? We started to see evidence of that during a certain period, and we went, no, this is who we are, so we reconnected. So an example of that is Terrapin Island, where when we started to look at not just the big stuff, but the tiny little stuff. What's hard to see on the right there are the deer trails. We altered plans to accommodate the natural patterns that were occurring there once we started looking again and seeing, as opposed to just being mechanical about it. This is where we started to establish maximum square footages on homes. In the 90s, there were periods where homes were getting larger and larger. And certainly it's like odd, because if you look at your protective covenants, there's a provision in there for most of us of you have to have a house of a certain size. There was a minimum size. That was the thought early on, is that people would build too small. Well, over time, what started to happen was people were building too big. So this was the beginnings of a strategy of sort of managing that and still respond to market conditions. And customizing home sites rather than treating home sites as commodities. I mentioned leading by example. Marsh is beautiful, but it's an acquired taste. And more often than not, it's not obvious when you first come here. You're drawn to golf or drawn to the beach. That's natural. I can relate to that. I grew up in the middle of cornfields of Ohio. And so I want to get to it. But when you're here for a moderately short period of time, you start to get pulled to the marsh. So the company led by example in terms of the 3 club cottages they designed and built of what it's like to live on the marsh. It's a literal example of what it might be. The beach club site was selected. I mean, that would have been a great individual home site that probably would have been the most valuable home site on Kiawah. But the choice was that it should be accessible to greater numbers than just privatizing certain. You'll see that throughout. The decision at the river course with Tom Fazio was to take substantial edges along the river and almost 100%, a little bit of percentage, but almost 100% of the area around Bass Pond, and have that as a part of the open space system rather than to have home sites along there. And again, you'll see a difference in terms of how golf courses are designed at the later stage. All right, John, I have this shot in here. That was like on cue. So the last area that I want to share with you is Ocean Park. And because there's a little bit of, well, what is there about the future? And if you remember, when I shared with you some examples of projects that were vetted and rejected, another example of that was in the early 70s, the idea for then Cougar Island was that it was going to be large compound lots. But look at this. This is where the ocean course is, right there. And that was just an idea. It was just an idea of, well, maybe that should just be privatized out there. So if there's any sort of hesitancy or debate about the new owners of Kiawah and their commitment to the vision, I would suggest you check out Ocean Park, because what they've done is to honor the commitment of revisiting those value systems and building upon a decision that was first initiated by the second group in the early 80s of setting aside land for the ocean course. So instead of lots out here, those were lots out in here where the ocean course is, and there, that's green space. That's active recreation green space. And the parkland area on the inside, the first phase of the park is this, if you've been out there. This is probably the purest example of a more collaborative effort by more than just the master developer to realizing a vision. So you have Kiawah Island Golf, responsible and steward for this area. You have the community association involved. And then when I was doing field work one day, I found this motley crew out on Little Bear Island in terms of the stewardship of Little Bear Island, the largest set-aside by the company, in terms of a couple hundred acres at least, I think, being a part of that too. And the town. The town is an integrated part when they go through a development agreement process with the master developer and the resort, as an aside, in which they collaborate with the property owner in a set of standards that can realize the vision from their standpoint too. So it's a far more collaborative process than the early process existed. The process, though, of planning, design, research, observing, constant observing, it still was happening at Ocean Park. These early shots, the approach to assessing land, tracked and echoed much of the early way of doing things. These layers that started to look at different conditions, these were the specimen oak trees, and they were so dense that we just stopped marking them on a drawing like this because it was all green. So we had to discover ways to visualize, well, how do you create a community in this unbelievably rich environment? It's sort of like a mini version of what Kiawah was like at that stage. It's less than 300 acres, but it's like this mini version of the 10,000 acre version. Now, the odd part of this is that people like the romantic notion of living in nature until they start doing it, and then it's creepy and scary. So what Diana is really good at, my wife and business partner, is trying to understand the nature of people's values, how they perceive purchase decisions, and then how they realize their dreams in a setting. So this is a little bit like C-SPAN. This is raw information here. But the idea was, rather than just say, there's an amenity out in the woods and so forth, it gets into the psychology of, on the right side, a garden is more like your home site, and the bigger forest is this sort of wilderness, whatever. What is the space in between? Kind of like the Starbucks of community. What is the space in between that can be common, safe, but you're within a natural framework? That's the idea of Ocean Park, is that it feels more settled and more communal in nature. And these shots I just took just recently, as I said, I'm too close to this one, way too close, but I would encourage you to go out and see it because it's the best version of realizing how we started in terms of analysis and expression. So I'm going to end with where we started.